Welcome to the Hauenstein Center's new online program, Lunch and Learn. I'm your host, Gleaves Whitney, and during the stay-home orders, we may not be able to journey much beyond our homes, but that should not stop us from journeying beyond our minds. Today's journey takes us to all kinds of fascinating places, starting with the National Mall in Washington, D.C., because of what that space says about the changing nature of America and about our relationship to a changing Western civilization and the implications for U.S. foreign policy around the globe. Our guide is Professor Michael Kimmage, a history professor since 2005 at the Catholic University of America. He also served in the U.S. Department of State from 2014 to 2016. And he recently had a very important, a very provocative book published, a book that I have enjoyed a great deal, called The Abandonment of the West, the History of an Idea in American Foreign Policy, which we will explore. My conversation with Professor Kimmage will go about 45 minutes or so, followed by questions from our viewers. So feel free to begin sending your questions to us at any time using your Zoom toolbar to do so. Professor Kimmage, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you, Gleaves, so much for having me and for setting this up. It's a pleasure to be at your center as close as one can get at the moment.
Well, we're glad to have you. Well, let's start with a definition of one of the key words in your title. What is the West?
I think that there are two necessary responses to that question, at least from the author of my book. And the first is that the West is many, many things, often contradictory. And it's a difficult word to define. It's slippery. And in part, I think it's so present because there are so many meanings, and we could run through all of those meanings at great length, from a connection to classical antiquity, a connection to the 18th century Enlightenment, capitalism, socialism, Judeo-Christian ethics, or that tradition as well, and all of those can be the West and much more. But what I've done in my book is to try to narrow it down so that I can tell a story about the West, and so I've used one of many possible definitions, and that is a Euro-American narrative of liberty and self-government. So some sense of a shared heritage or a history is a part of that. The commitment on the American end, and at times on the European, is to the idea of liberty or self-government as opposed to authoritarian forms of government. And that's an idea that, again, is not the only American idea of the West, but is pretty much the dominant one in American foreign policy, to be sure.
You use a very powerful trope to visualize the course of American history in your book. You say that the United States began as a Columbian Republic and basically remained that republic for more than 100 years. What does that mean?
Yes, this is a complicated dynamic. It goes back really quite deeply into American history, all the way back to the 17th century, before there was an American Republic, when this idea of the New World as Columbia took root, a sort of mythic land that was connected to Christopher Columbus. And that word, Columbia, has really stuck with us. And that's one of the reasons why the capital of the eventual American Republic is Washington, D.C., in the District of Columbia. That was a 18th, early 19th century decision. And you find the word Columbus and Columbia, everywhere in the late 18th century, and you find it even more across the 19th century. Universities, magazines, rivers, states, cities, etc. But more than just the enthusiasm for Columbus, which is, a large fact of 19th century American life, what I mean by the Colombian Republic is something a little bit more precise. So this is really 1880s, 1890s, first decade perhaps of the 20th century, a country that did define itself, you could say, in the image of Christopher Columbus. And so you have all of the anniversaries and celebrations in 1892, the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival in the Americas. And what Americans at the time, or at least some of them, read into this was that the United States is enterprising, it's an exploring country, it's casting out for new lands, territories, places to discover. It's technological, so Columbus was celebrated in America as a navigator, and he was also celebrated in a mural in the Library of Congress as the progenitor of commerce in America, which is maybe a bit of a reach, but that's how they saw it in the late 19th century. So commerce, enterprise, navigation, movement, exploration, dynamism. These were the virtues that proponents of the Colombian Republic read into both the legacy of Christopher Columbus and the sort of spirit of the United States at the turn of the century.
And then something changed between the, say, Spanish-American War, 1898, and World War I, 1914, 1918. How did America's view of itself and its relation to the West and to the world become transformed during those critical 2 decades?
Well, the key change is maybe not so much in the image of the United States. That really is formed at the early stages of the Colombian Republic. So again, early 1890s, and we can speak in a moment, if you will, about the Chicago World's Fair of 1893, which really does so much to launch this whole story. That image stays the same: enterprising, dynamic, technological, etc. Teddy Roosevelt starts to translate that into naval and military power. Other presidents, McKinley with the Spanish-American War, do so as well. But none of them were actors on the world stage in the way that Woodrow Wilson was. So what you need for the Colombian Republic to matter internationally is for the European state system to collapse, as it did in the First World War. So the great empires of Europe go to war with each other in the First World War. Many of them, the Ottoman, the German, and the Russian, don't survive the war. France and Britain are not quite the powers they were after the First World War. And then you have in 1919 this American president in Paris who's making some very bold and expansive claims, both about American foreign policy and really how international affairs should be structured and how they should be run. That, I think, is a legacy of the Colombian Republic. And you could put it this way: in 1918, 1919, Woodrow Wilson makes the case for the Colombian Republic as a kind of world leader or as a leader of the West, as Wilson would certainly have been comfortable saying. The proposition is first extended, you could say then, at the end of the First World War.
Tell us more about the Chicago World's Fair that you just alluded to.
Yes, I do see this as the start of my story, and this was 401 years after the arrival of Columbus in the Americas. So they wanted to do it in 1892. They were a little bit late getting it all together, and it was something quite extraordinary. It attracted a global audience. It attracted an audience, an American audience of people in the millions, much beyond the hopes of the organizers of the fair. And it had many fascinating good and bad sides from our point of view. In terms of the good sides, there was lots of architectural innovation. There was certainly a celebration of American technology. Columbus was front and center at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, and it was creative, inventive, and it sort of put the U.S. On the map in a new way for a global audience in the 1890s. There was also a sense of some people belonging to the fair and others not belonging. So it was really a fair for white Americans, you could say. And there were many groups that were excluded from participation and from representation in the fair. And there was a sort of patronizing attitude toward non-Western peoples at the fair, which was both a feature of the times and a feature of the fair. So it's a complicated event in American history. It means many things for American culture. What I think is significant, if you take a step back from the fair, it's just the ambition that you see on display. This is a country that matters. This is a country that's going places. We wish to make our mark. That's the message that was sent from the fair. And if you think 10, 20, 30 years forward, that message was worth listening to in 1893.
So if we go from the Midway in Chicago east and go to Washington, D.C., you also have the Mcmillan Plan that starts to unfold at this time. What a fascinating study in architecture, landscape architecture, our national symbols. Tell us about the Mcmillan Plan.
Right. Well, the Chicago World's Fair, which is this huge event, it was folded up in 1894, or I think actually in the fall of 1893, they sort of took it down. And only one building in Chicago remains from the fair. And otherwise, it sort of left us with Cracker Jacks and perhaps the Blue Ribbon Beer and the Ferris wheel, which are all delightful things and sort of icons of popular American culture. But the fair, you could say, vanished, and the city of Chicago moved on. The genuine importance of the Chicago World's Fair for our national life is in the National Mall. So let me back up for just a second in terms of the Mcmillan Plan. So the city of Washington in the 1890s was dirty, it was chaotic, and really did not resemble the city that we know today. The National Mall was there, sort of in embryo, but was covered with train tracks. Pennsylvania Avenue was, sort of an unpleasant, dirty, raucous street. And remarkably, you have three architects from the Chicago World's Fair, Frederick Law Olmsted, Charles McKim, and Daniel Burnham, who suggest a new capital city. Architects might do this sort of thing all the time, but the extraordinary thing is that they were taken up on their ideas, and that was actually Michigan Senator Mcmillan who spearheaded this project in Congress, and so it became known as the Mcmillan Plan. The Mcmillan Plan was remarkably ambitious. So one of the things that it did was move the train, sort of the train station of Washington from where it used to be, which is now where the National Gallery of Art is, to where it now is, to Union Station, which was completed in 1908, a very spectacular neoclassical structure. The other thing that the Mcmillan Plan did was to extend the National Mall down to the Lincoln Memorial, which was a part of the Mcmillan Plan, and sort of open the National Mall in a grand and dramatic way. And then finally, there were sort of unanticipated additions that came from the Mcmillan Plan. So you have many of the Smithsonian structures that define the city at the present that came because of the Mcmillan Plan and because of the space that it opened up. So I don't think it would be an understatement to say that the Mcmillan Plan forever determined the sort of spirit, the image, the structure of Washington, D.C., and through that told a particular story, a kind of narrative about American politics, and even, I would say, about American foreign policy.
Your book also talks about a number of interesting individuals, Michael, and I was wondering if you would like to talk about one or two of the heroes, really, of the narrative here. For example, you and I have spoken of Eisenhower as one of your heroes. Tell us more about that, and anybody else you would like to mention.
Sure. Maybe I can mention three very different kinds of heroes that figure in this book. Say Eisenhower, W.E.B. Du Bois, and let's go to the easy one, to Truman before Eisenhower. So one Democrat, one Republican, and one critic of American foreign policy, all of whom made very, very important contributions to the way that the West is understood in our culture and the way that it's functioned in American foreign policy. In fact, let me go chronologically with presidents from Truman to Eisenhower, and then I'll back up and speak about W.E.B. Du Bois. So Truman is the president to whom a great deal happened. First of all, becoming president in the spring of 1945 unexpectedly when Franklin Roosevelt died, and he was not somebody who was especially versed in high politics, foreign affairs, etc. So he had to be a quick study. I think that story is well known, how he had to deal with the aftermath of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War, and he established policies for that and strategies that stayed in place until the end of the Cold War. That, I think, is a familiar story about Truman, and one which there's certainly much to admire. What I particularly admire about Truman in the context of this book, and the story I'm trying to tell, is that Truman had a very pronounced popular touch. So he didn't go to college, Truman. That's one extraordinary detail about him. He had lots of professional failure in his life, especially in his 20s and 30s. And I think that gave him maybe a particular kind of humility. He also, I think, was very aware coming to the White House through local politics and then through the Senate about how foreign policy has to be communicated to the public at large, and the public has to be convinced. So when Truman is faced with the task of getting the Marshall Plan passed, this huge transfer of money from the United States to Europe, he was skillful at doing that. So he named it the Marshall Plan, for one, because he himself was an unpopular president at the time. And then he expended enormous effort on Capitol Hill to get support for the plan. I think that regardless of what the details of a foreign policy are, that's the method, that's the recipe that any successful president is going to have to rely on to integrate domestic and foreign policy, and also to communicate, not just to elite audiences, but also to popular audiences, what a foreign policy is about and why it's worth supporting. And I think Truman had a gift for that. To move on to Eisenhower, I think Eisenhower is a very different kind of figure, of course. He's a celebrity long before he becomes president. In some ways, he didn't want to become president. in 1952. And I think that the contribution of Eisenhower, in addition to all of the obvious accolades, D-Day and his leadership during the Second World War, and then president of Columbia University and two-term American president, all of that is clear with Eisenhower. But I think that the genius of the man was in his bipartisanship. So we could speak of another aspect of the successful American foreign policy. It's not just that there's local, regional support for it, but Eisenhower was, of course, a Republican. He didn't come in and sort of reverse everything that Truman had done. He changed it in some ways, but he also built upon it. And I think that that made American foreign policy very strong in those years. You sort of looked at the US from the outside and you said, well, if it's a Democrat or it's a Republican, I kind of face the same strategy. And there was coherence to that and continuity. And I think Eisenhower was very good at not putting his own ego front and center. It wasn't the Eisenhower story. He was able to put a national story at the center of his presidency, and that worked. Now, needless to say, both Truman and Eisenhower were avid defenders of the West, and this goes back to their childhoods in the Midwest, where they acquired classical learning, and they had great respect, both of them, for the history of antiquity, for European history, and felt this very powerful bond between the United States and Europe, which they articulated in a very clear language, both of them, a clear language of Western civilization, of which they felt to be a part. And I cite from Winston Churchill in my book, 1952, he rides on the presidential yacht with Truman, and Churchill said, as only Churchill could, "You, Harry, more than anybody, has saved Western civilization in the last couple of years." So that was, that was the ideal to which they were committed, and that was also something that they held in common. Now, if we look at W.E.B. Du Bois, who's an African-American from Massachusetts who graduates from Harvard in the mid-1890s, he's telling a very different story about the West, and he's doing so with great academic and intellectual brilliance. He made connections between American foreign policy and the age of empire that were very real, starting with the Spanish Civil War and the realities of the early 20th century. He scrutinized the history of slavery to see what it had to say about the evolution and development of the West, and that too is a highly important story. And he widened the perspective. He looked deeply into the politics and the history of Africa and was capable, willing, eager to see the depredations of the West in Africa. And he wrote very critically of those things. And in those critical writings is a series of very, very valuable lessons about how foreign policy can be blinkered, how the danger of white supremacy is sort of ever present in different periods of American history, and how you need to have a view of the world that's larger than just Europe and the United States. So of course, he would have been a critic of Truman and Eisenhower. So these are three very different kinds of heroes, but I think that they're making each of them very significant contributions to this American notion of the West.
And then something happens right after these people pass from the scene, whether it's Du Bois or Truman, Eisenhower, at least in their public lives. 1963 is a pivotal year in your book. It's structurally apparent from your book. What happened in 1963?
Yes, I do see 1963 as the end of an era. And let me begin with two data points about things that happened in 1963 and then sketch what I mean about a very profound transition that begins in that dark year in American history, dark because of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. But the two data points are John F. Kennedy's speech in West Berlin, the Ich bin ein Berliner speech, which he gave in the summer of 1963, which is, I think, the very high point of this Western narrative, Western affiliation, Western connection to Europe. This is, after all, an American president speaking to a European audience. The speech went over very well in Berlin at the time, and is still looked back on fondly in Germany as a kind of bridge that was built between the two countries. So it did everything that the president would have wanted it to do. And if you go back and listen or watch the speech, what's extraordinary is how telegraphic it is, how poetic, how vivid, how attuned it is to audience and to place, give it the edge of the Berlin Wall. And also Kennedy's delivery of it is just masterful. I think maybe not in content, one of the greatest presidential speeches, but in style, delivery, in effect, certainly up there. Not quite the Gettysburg Address, but almost in that category. Likewise, you have publication in 1963 by University of Chicago professor William McNeill, a book titled The Rise of the West, which was a densely printed 800-page book that chronicled the history of the West as McNeill saw it from the Greeks and the Romans to the world of the 1950s. And here you have a sort of academic celebration of the West. And McNeill was critical of some things and certainly versed in Islamic history and Chinese history and non-Western histories, but he did want to tell a unique story about the West, and he felt that law, liberty, freedom were vehicles of the West, and that the West was a vehicle of law, liberty, and freedom. Interestingly, it's not a very Cold War book in spirit. He doesn't sort of engage in that fight, but he does certainly celebrate the West as John F. Kennedy did on a different stage in West Berlin. So those two things happen in 1963, but then Kennedy is assassinated in November, and that becomes, I think, truly a psychological break, a psychological transition in American life. There's a before and an after with that event. It's symbolism perhaps, or perceptions, but I think that that's one thing. But of course, the really significant policy change is the escalation in Vietnam, which Kennedy might have engaged in had he not been assassinated. That's a hypothetical, but Lyndon Johnson certainly does escalate. That introduces huge internal tensions about American foreign policy. It becomes a problem with American allies. Never has American foreign policy been as deeply questioned as it was, let's say, from 1965 to 1975 in the major years of the Vietnam War. And the West just doesn't look the same. In the midst of Vietnam and after Vietnam, there's more polarization, there's more difference of opinion. This idea of the United States as a provider of liberty and self-government, sort of beacon of democracy, even to many Americans that doesn't ring true because of Vietnam. And the global situation is even more complicated as Germans and Russians and Africans look to the United States as it's fighting this very difficult and controversial war. So Vietnam is one thing, and then you have many changes in American culture that are not immediate in 1963, but will play themselves out in the 1960s and 70s, where you have really a kind of domestic revolution, and the country starts to look at itself differently. And this is the civil rights movement. This is various ethnic pride movements that attempt to change the narrative. There's a sort of a new questioning of who the American elite is and who the American elite should be. Not all of this concerned foreign policy, not all of this was about the West, but the West was very often in the background of these discussions and debates. So what you can say by way of conclusion in terms of the 60s and 70s is that there's incredible vitality. There's a really rich intellectual fight and debate about what the country is, where it's going, what it should be, but there's less and less agreement. So what I mentioned a moment ago about Truman and Eisenhower, what's possible in 1952, a transition from a Democrat to a Republican, maybe a liberal to a conservative, if those are the right words, at any rate, from one president to another, there's so much that's perpetuated. That becomes more difficult, circa, let's say, 1975 or 1980, when these changes percolate through the political culture. That sort of agreement is more difficult to achieve. Now, as a scholar of this subject, I think you can come out in favor of these changes, you can come out against them. There's a lot that you can do in terms of judging them. I'm more interested in just establishing what these changes are and emphasizing their significance.
Clearly, you're describing what you call in your book the transition to a post-Columbian America. And it seems to me, as in so much else in the history that you and I study, Michael, is that it's in a polar tension, a dynamic tension with itself. So you still have elements of a Columbian America in dynamic tension with a post-Columbian America. Sometimes it manifests in a party platform, sometimes in a speech. You'll have a Pat Buchanan come along, for example, in 1992 in Houston at the Republican National Convention and talk very much in the spirit of a Columbian America. To what extent do you think that dynamic tension between a post-Columbian America that would clearly have moved into that paradigm, that transition, and the continued existence of a Columbian America in a remnant of American intelligentsia, to what extent is that dynamic alive, well, and healthy for the Republic?
Well, let me answer it for your question, if you don't mind, let me answer it for the 80s and 90s. And I think that the discussion to have about the present moment, which does come from this period, I'm quite sure, is maybe a bit of a different one. But let me answer the question for the 80s and 90s. So it's a bit of a paradox, to be sure, because if you stay at the surface of American foreign policy, what you see, say, from 1975 to 1990 is an unbelievable success story. So all of this gloom and doom about Vietnam, which is pervasive in the early 70s, the energy crisis, malaise, a country that's lost its self-confidence, all of these phrases that we have from the 1970s, they were off the mark because, the 1980s is going to begin this period of Soviet unraveling. Reagan doesn't suffer from a lack of self-confidence. I'm very skeptical of triumphalist narratives at the end of the Cold War. I think that they're dangerous for us here at home. And I also think that they're historically false because the Soviet Union falls apart for reasons that often have very little to do with the United States. But be that as it may, the foreign policy success of the US 1989, 1990, 1991 is self-evident, right? The major enemy disappears. You get a unified Germany and NATO. You get the chance for the US to sort of dictate terms or set terms, inspire terms for the security order in Europe. And there seems to be, and I think for many years was, a great validation of the American way of doing things in the 1990s, of running an economy, of structuring a government, of establishing certain modern political ideals. All of that is a very, very important story to tell. Maybe it's the biggest story that you can tell about the US in the shadow of the Vietnam War, that it didn't recede from the international stage. In fact, it sort of surged forward and experienced some pretty big victories in the late 80s and early 90s. On the other hand, when you sort of peer beneath the surface, it is at least disconcerting to see how radical the internal disagreements are. It's almost as if the Cold War sort of kept a lid on it for a while. Maybe the Cold War was so frightening that it sort of reminded Americans of the existential things that they have in common. But as that lid was lifted in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you just see an intensification of these internal disagreements. And there are those Americans who feel that Columbus is a villain, that he perpetrated genocide, that he was nothing other than an imperialist who wanted to impose Europe's will on populations that wanted to have nothing to do with him, and that a real trauma or tragedy begins in 1492, and we're still living in the midst of that. And you'll see that in lots of academic and scholarly literature, both on Columbus and so the overall narrative of Europe's collision with the Americas, starting in the late 15th century. And on the other hand, you have figures that you mentioned as well, like Pat Buchanan, who were quite strident in their desire to sort of keep on with the old way of doing things. And you're entirely right. For Buchanan, Columbus is a crucial figure, and he's very upset that Columbus is not being celebrated at American schools and universities. But Columbus isn't the crux of it, although I think he helps us understand a profound difference between the 1890s and the 1990s. The simple question of why was he a hero, for the most part, officially at least, in the 1890s, and why was he so argued about and fought over in the 1990s is simply an interesting question. But behind that is sort of a culture to a degree at odds with itself, and unable to agree on who the heroes are, who the heroes should be, sort of what the common ground or what the center point is. And I think that that's there below the surface of these really quite successful 1990s. So it's paradoxical, but I suppose we at the present moment are the children of that paradox.
I think one of the finest parts of your book, Michael, is your conclusion. This peroration talks about architecture and monuments and landscapes and even one lone bust in the State Department. Tell us what you were trying to get across to readers as your book draws to a close.
Well, I do think one of the very extraordinary things about Washington, D.C., and it's typical of national capitals, but this is our national capital, so it's perhaps especially extraordinary to those of us here. But as it struggles to tell a story, it tells a story, it tells different stories over time, it tells the same story over time, and that in and of itself I find to be a very intriguing aspect. What is this city meant to signify. And Washington as an artificial city, which is to say a city that was the planned national capital, not a Philadelphia or a Boston or New York, which were established cities when you see the creation of the American Republic. Washington is not. It's a work in progress. Charles Dickens calls it in 1852 the city of magnificent intentions, which is such a wonderful phrase for Washington. So it's an unbuilt city even in 1852, and then it all gets sort of filled in. So it's maybe even more representative than some other national capitals might be. Let me mention three sort of points along the way in terms of the book and in terms of the story of 20th century and 21st century Washington, D.C. The first we've already encountered, and that's the National Mall. And what you really see from the 1890s through, say, the 1950s, which is neoclassical Washington. The city would be unthinkable without that architectural aesthetic. That's the National Archives, it's the Supreme Court building, it's the Capitol building, which is, from the 1850s and earlier. It's the Jefferson Memorial, it's the Lincoln Memorial. It's really much of what we think of as important in Washington is this neoclassical city. That, in the eyes of the people who created those plans, Mcmillan, the architects, and others, was meant to tell a story about democracy and meant to tell a story about the progress, this is the word they would have used, the progress of liberty. How liberty is progressing and how liberty is a part of progress. What do you need for liberty to progress? What does the National Mall tell us? Some connection to antiquity for sure, probably more Roman than Greek, but you have a kind of Roman Capitol building, but then you have a Greek-style pantheon of a Lincoln Memorial. You get both on the National Mall, but also study and learning. So the Library of Congress is almost on the National Mall, and certainly the great museums, art collections, and others are there as well. So if you're going to have liberty, if liberty is to progress, it has to be connected to the study, intellectual development, the life of the mind, and thus does sort of democracy and self-government move forward. That's a very powerful narrative that's really embedded in the heart of the city. Another narrative that I'm less fond of, I can say directly now in this format, is the technocratic city of Washington, which is also quite powerful. I don't write about this in the book, but the Pentagon would be a great example of this. I mean, it really is sort of most impressive from the air, the Pentagon, but it's a remarkably office-like office building in most respects, and it doesn't seem to tell, as far as I can intuit, any real story about the country or about the country's politics. But I do write in the book quite critically about the 1960 State Department building, which is such a chance to say something about American foreign policy and America's place in the world. And it's such a bland and uninteresting building. And it's just remarkable also, given how much text and statuary a lot of these earlier Washington buildings have. It's just remarkable how little it invests in any of that, with one exception, which you mentioned, which is the bust, the solitary, lonely bust of Montesquieu, author of The Spirit of Laws, a wonderful presence to have in the State Department. But he's there sort of next to a room that they have for parties, for people's promotions, sort of forlorn. And you wouldn't even know it's Montesquieu unless you would go up and look at it closely. So it's a building that doesn't want to tell a story. And that just seems like a shame to me. And you can get that feeling in a lot of different Washington buildings. The building that I address at the end of the book is the most recent addition to the National Mall, is the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And just by the standards of civic life, when you walk by the building as a Washingtonian, the lines are out the door. There's an excitement and enthusiasm there that's present in no other Washington museum at the present. And there has been since the building was dedicated in September 2016, just a great affection for the structure. And I think what's remarkable about that building is that it's new. It's not white for, I think, more than one reason. It's a distinctive architecture. It makes reference to African architectural patterns, which, as far as I know, no other building on the National Mall does. So it says all of those things. It underscores the African element in a museum of African American history. And at the same time, it's very much in dialogue with the National Mall. So the angles of its stories are at 17 degrees, which is the exact same angle of the triangles on the top of the Washington Monument. So it's meant to evoke that. Your sight lines, when you go by it, sort of shape, depending on which way you're looking, your view of the Capitol or your view of the Washington Monument. And the content of the museum is about the achievement of self-government. So it is the same story. It is, in a sense, the old story, but it's told in a very new way. And that seems to me exactly the right way to do it. You don't just keep on building the Jefferson Memorial. That's too dull and boring. You build new memorials, new buildings, but as long as they stay in dialogue with the older ones, you're still telling something of the same story. And that to me seems necessary and desirable.
Well put. And I so highly recommend when people pick up your book that they read it carefully and do not neglect that conclusion. Let me ask you a couple of meta-historical questions. You and I are historians. We like to think about this kind of thing. And I think a number of our audience would too. So, you know, we got this idea of historic change and continuity. As we think about that, do we need civilizational units called civilizations and the narratives they provide? Do we need something as historians between nation states and entire globe, the entire globe with its world histories?
I think so. I mean, they make a lot of our fellow academics uncomfortable, this sort of discourse and conversation. And to go back to a book that I mentioned in my own book, Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, which made a big stir in foreign policy circles, but was pretty roundly condemned in academia as drawing borders and separating off people from each other and limiting. And up to a point, I'm sympathetic to the academic critique of civilization. Certainly, it can promote chauvinism. You can create unnecessary boundaries. The boundary between the Muslim and the Christian world is a very permeable boundary historically. Lots of transfer of ideas and books and texts. In part, the history of classical antiquity comes to us through Arab translations of Plato and Aristotle in books that we think of as indigenously Western, and that's sort of crucial for any understanding of civilization. But I think it can't be dispensed with. I think there's this zone of both history and politics that's nebulous. It's sort of in between religion and language, maybe sensibility, but it's clearly there. And whether Huntington is exactly right about this zone being the conflict zone of the present, I mean, I think after September 11th, there was a sort of sense that maybe Huntington was onto something. But if you read his book, it often is a bit sort of schematic. And so obviously there are other zones that matter as well. The nation state issues that are of sort of global scope. Coronavirus, I don't think is profitably understood in civilizational terms. That's not the crisis that will bring out civilization, but the Ukraine crisis that began in 2014 has lots of civilizational overtones, lots of religious overtones. There's an East and a West there. The different actors tend to interpret things in civilizational terms. So I don't think that you can understand the Ukraine crisis unless you look into the history of civilization and see why it matters to people. So I think it has to be there, even if it brings forward certain uncomfortable truths, or maybe especially if it brings forward certain uncomfortable truths. And the historians are just the poorer for not taking it into account.
So how should we think about the West moving forward? How should we teach it?
Right.
Big question.
Well, this, yes, it is a big question. I'm simply happy at this stage when people care about that question and care about that debate. One thing that I noticed from the culture wars of the 1980s, which were sort of a big story, and academics were involved, and you had Bill Bennett, the Secretary of Education, who was in the mix and sort of fighting out the culture wars, and they were about curricula and what to teach and what to celebrate, who to have as a role model, all of that. When I look back with that, I have a certain nostalgia just because of the intensity, the vitality of that debate and discussion. Now I have a kind of concern that it's all sort of fading into an internet-driven culture in which books are not that important to begin with, and people sort of talk past each other and don't really engage. So I think controversy is certainly to the good, and in a sense, if it brings more attention to these issues and these questions, that's valuable. What I would suggest for American foreign policy and for universities, these are two different areas, not to be conjoined as they often were in the early Cold War. For American foreign policy, I think the language of the West is valuable. I think it can be done in a tolerant way without sort of undue chest thumping. But of course, the US has to have a global foreign policy. So the West is the kind of thing that an American president or Secretary of State should emphasize in Europe. And you might go to the Middle East and Asia and speak about similar principles, liberty, self-government, human rights, etc. But you know, be aware of your audience. And there, I think a sort of robust language of the West could be off-putting. So with certain allowances for audience and messaging, I think there's still very much a place for the West in American foreign policy. For universities, you know, I feel myself to be sort of a great outlier in this respect from what I can gather. I think that there's a place for the West as well. There's a place for many other things. It's not, I think, the exclusive frame that it sort of was in the 1950s and before. It has to share the limelight with other civilizations and other categories of experience and categories of sort of organizing thoughts and people. But I don't see how you can understand the founding of the American Republic without some grasp of political thought and experience in antiquity. I don't see how you can do that without some grasp of thought and experience in the 18th century Enlightenment. At the very least, even if you're a critic of the West, you want to know what all these presidents and secretaries of state and others were talking about. So if we get too far away from the West, I fear that our own sort of tradition, country, politics could become sort of illegible to us. And so to that extent, I think universities have a responsibility to continue teaching this material.
You know, you let this idea for this book incubate for, I think, for more than a decade, as you describe, you know, how it came to be. And I'm fascinated by, you know, you finally decide you're going to write this book. And I'm curious, how did your ideas about the West change in the course of all the conversations and colloquia, you know, in Europe and in the United States that you were part of over the better part of a decade?
Well, the book began as you know, sort of graduate students' projects often do something. So I was writing a dissertation on Whittaker Chambers and Lionel Trilling, who spoke constantly about the West in geopolitics, the West in culture, the West in art, literature, philosophy. So it's everywhere. And I wanted to get a book on the topic to understand what they meant when they talked about the West. And I realized that there wasn't any such book, not in US history. There are lots of histories of the West in German history, in Italian history, French history, British history, Russian history, Turkish history, Japanese, etc., but not in American history. And so I made a note of that as a graduate student and wanted to follow up at some point. So that was the genesis of the project in its simplest sense. But I've always enjoyed the controversy around the West. So if it's Alan Bloom, if it's Francis Fukuyama, if it's Edward Said, if it's Huntington, these are these huge books that they wrote in the last 30, 40 years, and they tend to be books about the West. And that just intrigues me, why it provokes attention, why it provokes disagreement, why it provokes interest. When you could just say what matters in American politics and American foreign policy is American material, American ideas, American thoughts. Isn't Thomas Jefferson enough? And you know, the rest of the American tradition, why do you have to deal with the West and bring this in? And yet it's always, or very often, there. So I wanted to trace that as well, and very much enjoyed tracing that in the research. What I came to feel in 2016, when Trump was elected, there's a new framework for understanding this issue, that there's more up for grabs in American politics and American foreign policy than I believed to be the case in 2015. There's more that's contested. There's more that's, you know, sort of more scenarios that you can imagine in the future that could be very, very different from how things are in the present. And all that made me want to do is finish the book more quickly and sort of get it out there, because if things are up for grabs, you know, perhaps it's helpful to have some definitions and some storytelling about what the West was in the past. But I do think, you know, the transition from George W. Bush to Obama is in some respects superficial compared to the transition between Obama and Trump. And that means that there's really something afoot in American politics. And a lot of this is about American foreign policy. So from my point of view, what better time to be commenting on and trying to figure out this story of the West?
I hear you. And, you know, I do want to get into another whole part of your life. I mean, you've worked not only as an historian at a university for some 15 years, you've also served in the U.S. State Department in the Office of Policy Planning from 2014 to 2016. What does the Office of Policy Planning do, Michael?
Well, it was founded in 1947 by George Kennan, probably the greatest American diplomat in U.S. history, and he founded it at the command of George Marshall, who had come to the State Department from the military, of course. And he asked at the State Department when he got there, who does planning around here? And the answer was nobody. So he created an Office of Policy Planning to get the job done. And one of the very first proposals from the Office of Policy Planning was, in fact, the Marshall Plan. So they've had an illustrious history from the beginning that's pretty difficult to live up to. But in its more modern forms, the Office of Policy Planning is there to engage the world of ideas, so the world of academia and think tanks and journalism. It's there to provide longer range thinking for the secretary. That might mean 3 months ahead or 6 months ahead, or at the very most a year ahead. And it's also supposed to channel unconventional critical thinking, dissents from how the rest of the building, the State Department, is formulating foreign policy. So it's probably the closest to academia of any office in the whole of the U.S. government. So it's a very, very nice place for an academic to be. If I could distill a lesson from my time at policy planning, what had happened in the last couple of years is that the speechwriters for the secretary were brought into the Office of Policy Planning. And so that gave me insight into how you articulate a foreign policy. And one of the things I distilled is just how important that is. You can have a perfect policy, you can kind of come up with the best memos and the best analysis and have the best intelligence and all of that. But if you can't communicate it, it's not going to go very far. And so that's in part why I'm so admiring of the 1963 speech by John F. Kennedy. Kennedy didn't innovate when it comes to American foreign policy. It was all set by 1961. He doesn't really change the strategy, he doesn't change the direction of the US, but he was very, very good at articulating what it meant and what it signified, and sort of how it looked in its ideal form. There's a great deal to learn from that. That's amazingly significant. What I would add to that, and that's what I was trying to get across with the points about Truman, is also how important it is to articulate foreign policy to our population here at home. I'm not quite sure we did enough of that in our office. That's probably one area where I would be self-critical, but I think you need to have the secretary going out not just to New York and DC, but to other places and engaging audiences. This is why we're doing things. This is why we believe a certain issue to be a crisis or an opportunity. These are what our ideals are when it comes to foreign policy. And again, that's a matter of clear, elegant, sort of vivid description and communication. And, a really good Office of Policy Planning will give you both. It will, help to coalesce the strategy that the President and the Secretary of State has, and it will also give you options for clearly articulating that and hopefully to the right audiences as well.
We mentioned speechwriting, and you probably know in an earlier iteration of my career, I was a speechwriter for Michigan Governor John Engler for a number of years. And as I wholeheartedly agree, you've got to translate that policy. We used to kid the governor. We'd say, look, you want to sell the TV from all the circuitry in the back. You got to turn it around so that people can see the TV from the front, the picture. You got to sell the TV from the picture tube point of view, not the circuitry. And so in the State Department, I think sometimes we encounter the same mindset. I mean, sometimes people want to get into the weeds of the circuitry and they forget what's this going to look like in the picture tube. And going back to Kennedy's speech as inaugural, 90% of his inaugural address in '61 was, of course, foreign policy. It seems to embody so much of what you're talking about, the foreign policy vision of the United States, but very grounded in a Western perspective, very much with the words that you've described: self-government, liberty, freedom. All of those sentiments are embedded, instantiated in Kennedy's rhetoric. And so what you're talking about later is really a variation on that theme. So I think there's a lot to say about what you're broaching here. Let me just ask you this: did your work at State change your academic understanding of transatlantic relations in the West substantially?
Yes, I think it made me. And maybe this sounds odd given the discussion we've been having and much of the book, but it's simply the case. It made me a little bit more, a bit chastened at times, how difficult it is to accomplish things, how you sort of have to stick at times to your closest allies, and how sort of pivotal and crucial those relations are, and how you can't adopt a one-size-fits-all recipe for foreign policy. So that's the intricacy and the complexity of something like the West. It will work with certain audiences, certain moments, but it's not something that you can just plug in at any point. To go back to Kennedy for a moment, what I admire from Kennedy, I don't think I would have been able to see this before working at the State Department myself, is that he's actually doing two things in the inaugural address. He's affirming Western values, doing so unapologetically, sound the bugle, all of that. We will defend liberty everywhere where it's imperiled. He's doing that job. It's maybe a bit more messianic than I would like in a way, but he does it very well. But he also is speaking to decolonization in that inaugural address. You know, there are these nations that are emerging from imperialism, from colonialism. We, the United States, are at your side. And in a sense, he's sort of pursuing these two tracks simultaneously. He's affirming Western values, affirming the transatlantic relationship, to be sure, but he's also opening himself, opening his presidency to other constituencies, building bridges there as well. So he's very, very attuned to situation and audience. And I felt like when we lost that collectively at the State Department, we were punished for it. When we were able to retain that feeling of being very attuned to situation and audience, we were sort of rewarded for it policy-wise. But now there's nothing more interesting to me than to go back to history and just look about how things were in the past, and to sort of tally up successes and failures then, and to see if we can learn from them and apply them to sort of crises down the road.
Well, Cicero said that we should give 7 years to the Republic, and I think after your service there, you probably recommend that historians do a stint of public service at some point in their public service, right? Absolutely.
Absolutely.
I feel very strongly about that too. Yeah.
No, it's a gift to us. I hope that we give as much to the government as it gives to us. But certainly in terms of understanding and teaching, it's a wonderful thing to have in your background.
We have some people are queued up now to ask questions, but I can't let this question escape before we go to our queue. How has the coronavirus pandemic and the various ways of responding to it, you've seen both in our 50 laboratories of democracy and in Washington, D.C. and abroad, how has that in any way changed your thinking about the West, shaped how we should go forward in your view? Would you address that, please?
So, sure. Let me make 3 points in response. The first is about the transatlantic relationship, and I don't think it was in great shape before the coronavirus, like it's in worse shape during the coronavirus, and we should make efforts on both sides of the Atlantic to correct that. There should be more cooperation. There should be more, put it on the sort of people-to-people level, more sympathy that we show for one another, and that's I think simply an investment in the future. If you put the resources of Europe and the United States together, of course, there are many other countries you could work with on the coronavirus, but thinking through the lens of the transatlantic relationship, an enormous amount can be accomplished. If it becomes a kind of zero-sum race to see who's first to get the vaccines and as many face masks as possible, I think it will be slower, the recovery from this crisis. So I think more transatlantic cooperation is an easy thing to recommend in the midst of this crisis, and I would love to see it happen. I think that this is early in the crisis to say, but I think that the crisis has rewarded governments that have been direct and transparent in communication about the crisis. And here I would sort of hold up Germany as a good example. Angela Merkel came before the German public second week of March and really sort of laid out a very gloomy scenario. I'm sure it was very unpleasant to hear as a German, but I think it also helped people to adjust to the new reality that they were living in. That to me connects to the major arguments of my book: transparency, the virtues that we associate with the Bill of Rights, free media, sort of investigation into where governments are going to screw up, and it's an enormously difficult crisis, and governments, all of them, will screw up a lot in the midst of it, but we need to have public scrutiny of that. And that's something that we collectively, the US, Europe, and sympathetic countries, should be building into a narrative that self-government is not just a good unto itself, but it's going to help in dilemmas and crises of the kind that we're facing. It's clearly not the first or the last crisis of this kind that we're going to face, and I think we haven't done that at all. I don't think Merkel has done that. I don't think our president has done that. I don't see any Western politician who's really built that into a narrative so far. And that's brings me to the third point, which is worrisome, which is that China has been pretty good at building the counter narrative to that, which is that authoritarian governments are more efficient. They can control their populations. They can get them to sort of obey. And so China is really the sort of exemplary country in this case. I think if we had access to full information about China, we would see a very different reality, but that's the message that the government is making, not so ineffectively at the moment, and I would love to see that countered by what you could describe as a kind of Western message that would emphasize, not just solidarity and shared scientific cooperation, but also this narrative or story of liberty and self-government, being very valuable politically in the scheme of things.
Yes. Well, looking at our queue, we have Winston Elliott asking a couple of questions. He's writing to us from Houston, and he was my first guest in the Lunch and Learn series. So Winston has an honored place, and he would like your definition of the difference between an isolationist and a nationalist America First foreign policy. And then there's a follow-up question.
Sure. I think that there is clearly a distinction, and I think if we would look at the current administration, my guess is that they would be quite comfortable with a description of their foreign policy as nationalist. I think that Trump has used the word a few times, and certainly, close advisors, Stephen Miller, Steve Bannon, when he was in government, Mike Pompeo and others, I don't think that they would be at all uncomfortable with a nationalist America First frame. Obviously, America First was a campaign phrase and has been repeated extensively throughout the first term of Trump. And I think what's meant by that is that vigorous national action on the international stage is good. That might mean avoiding certain conflicts that don't involve the national interests. So it takes us perhaps to Trump's Syria policy and a few other issues. But on economic affairs, you can act very boldly on the international stage. You can be, in a sense, internationalist, but you're doing so in the name of national interest. You're protecting American manufacturing or industry by through tariffs and through other kinds of actions that stigmatize China and perhaps other countries in the name of the national interest. I think the point being that nationalist foreign policies can be activist. They can be very wide in scope, and I think the Trump administration would see themselves in those terms. Whereas I think an isolationist foreign policy really does try to build what had previously been called Fortress America, and to make the argument that we have these oceans around us, we have a very strong military, we're sort of sufficient to ourselves, and we don't need excessive involvement in the outside world. So the national interest is really, in that sense, understood as sort of protective. You have to guard yourself from those terrible things that can come from the outside, or guard yourself from overreaction. But the business of America is business, or internal affairs are really primary. So I don't think we've ever had an isolationist president, to be honest. We have had nationalist presidents, more than just one, but it's an important part of the political sensibility of the country. There's long been a kind of longing for an isolationist foreign policy.
And Winston's follow-up question, I think, is a good segue for the next question. He says, in such difficult times as these, should Americans continue to support a pretty expansive activist foreign policy?
I think that we've been overcommitted in our foreign policy for a long time. And I think that this comes from certain misinterpretations at the end of the Cold War. And in addition to that, sort of an exaggerated sense of what we can accomplish in the world. But in addition to that, a tendency to militarize foreign policy problems, in part because the US does have this extraordinary military superiority. So there's a temptation to use military power in response to problems that are not military in nature. It's a very complicated point, but I would would make this argument in relation to September 11th, that in the end it was not a military threat as such that we faced after September 11th. It was more something that could have been dealt with sort of policing and sort of intelligence services, maybe covert action. But both the Afghanistan and the Iraq War have proven to be fairly unsuccessful in terms of their stated aims, and do constitute the biggest part of American overreach. I think in that sense, 2008 was certainly a wake-up call, the financial crisis of 2008. And a lot of the Obama administration decisions, not all of them, but a lot of them are to be understood in the context, his understanding of restraint. So one of the reasons the US doesn't go to war with Russia over Ukraine has to do with the American economy and a desire on the part of the Obama administration not to increase the military expenditures and in a sense to sort of rein in confrontations that could have led in that direction. But I think from the vantage point of a President Trump, even that was too little. So there was a effort to sort of move back. But then if you look at the record of the Trump administration, actually military spending has gone up, and American military and other involvements in the world are not substantially less now than they were 4 years ago. I think that's proof. If you look at the last two presidents, Obama and Trump, both of them wanted to minimize the American footprint, to save money, to engage in nation building at home. That's Barack Obama's phrase, not Donald Trump's, but I'm sure Trump would agree with it. Both of them wanted to do that, and it proved to be very difficult. So either in a second Trump term, or if a new president comes to the White House in January, the one thing to learn from the Corona crisis is sort of better now than later in terms of cost-saving mechanisms, ways to very intelligently deploy American military power, but not to engage in overreach. It does seem to me among the most urgent foreign policy questions at the moment, how to keep relations with Russia and China from not going off the rails and getting us into very, very expensive and probably unnecessary confrontations. That's going to be a great and very, very important challenge in the months and years to come.
Changing registers a bit, we have a question now that's more of a historical nature. Are there any differences in the way the U.S. fought wars against other Western nations compared to non-Western nations? And the writer asks, say, the difference between Germany and Japan in World War II as an example.
I think there is a difference. I'm not an expert on the topic, and so I've really learned what I know about this topic from a historian by the name of John Dower, who wrote a book about the U.S. War in the Pacific called War Without Mercy. And so I borrow from him, but I've not really researched the subject, and I would almost defer to people who know more substantively the issues than I do. But from what I can observe, there's a twofold difference. So one of the things that the war became between the US and Japan was a race war. And so there was a stigmatization of the Japs, obviously internment of the Japanese within the US, and a sort of racializing. You see this in cartoons and images from the Second World War, a racializing image of Japanese that's not to be found, I think, either to the same degree or to really any degree with German Americans or with Germans. Obviously, Hitler was stigmatized and Germans were hated during the Second World War, but there wasn't that sort of racializing element. So that's one difference. And the other is that it goes back to Eisenhower. There's an extraordinary order that Eisenhower gives his soldiers on the morning of D-Day, and he made it several times after that, which is that this is a war, in a sense, in the name of the West, in the name of civilization. And so if there's a church or some important building, you've got to preserve it, even if there's a military cost to doing so, because this is what the war is about. I don't know this for a fact, but I'm going to guess that just wasn't the attitude when it came to Japan. So the firebombing of Tokyo and the sort of bombing campaigns, of course, the U.S. bombed Hamburg and Dresden and other German cities. So we go both ways on this. But I think that Japan was bombed without an eye to sort of its civilizational treasures. So there is, I think, that distinction. If we would go back to the Spanish-American War, I think there's much more evidence at that time of the dangers that can reside in fighting wars in the name of civilization. And I think some would make that argument about Vietnam, but there too, I feel like I'm at the edge of my expertise. But I think it is a factor, and it can be very risky to put yourself on the side of the civilized and put your enemy on the side of the uncivilized, and that can have negative consequences on the battlefield. So it's a language that military commanders and politicians should be careful with.
Goes all the way back to the beginnings, to Greeks and barbarians, doesn't it?
Indeed.
Could you speak more, this viewer asks, to the perspectives shared by W.B. Du Bois and James Baldwin regarding being in the West, but not entirely of the West?
Great. So I've mentioned Du Bois already, and Du Bois had a very long career. So he graduates from college in the 1890s, and then he dies, I think it's around 1960, maybe even a little later. But he dies, I think, at the age of 90 or so, and there are multiple chapters and phases in his career. So his own thinking evolves quite a bit on this point. What you see from his great, I think it's 1903 book, Souls of Black Folk, is the early Du Bois. And here you have somebody who had studied in Berlin at the Kaiser Wilhelm University, somebody who had done a PhD at Harvard, somebody who knew Greek and Latin, who writes in that book about sitting down with Aristotle and other great figures from Western civilization. The phrase he uses, and they winced not, they didn't wince. I'm part of their company, they're part of my company. This is a tradition that he was very happy, in a way proud to claim. And so for him to fight racism was to say that there should be no barrier to the study of these ideas, and to access to this education should be available to all, and is good for all, for the white American and for the African American. I don't know if he ever discarded that idea about education and books, but he does become progressively more despondent, I would say, about American foreign policy. He petitions the UN in 1947 on behalf of the African American population, protesting segregation. Eventually, he becomes very close to the Communist Party, becomes a Communist Party member, and then he dies in Ghana in exile, really, sort of thoroughly disgusted with what the United States is during the Cold War. So there was a feeling of participation on one level. It was certainly a very critical side to Du Bois, and it seems like the critical side came to the fore in the later decades of his life. Baldwin is a different thinker. Baldwin is less political. The essay that I look at in The Abandonment of the West, which is, I think, as great an essay as anybody has ever written on the topic, is called Stranger in the Village, which he published in the 1950s, about a winter he spent in a village in Switzerland. And he looks at the church there. He comes from Paris. He was living in Paris at the time, an intellectual, published author. And he looks at the church and he says, the villagers in this church are connected to this church in a way that I am not. And they're connected to Beethoven and to Aristotle and to all of these Western ornaments in a way that I'm not. I trace my heritage back to Africa, where I'm perpetually watching the European, sort of slave traders or colonizers arrive. That's one part of the Baldwin essay. And then at the very end of the essay, he sort of looks at the United States as to a degree unique, and says that white Americans are, in fact, whether they like it or not, they're sort of the least white of white people. They're the most influenced by African American culture. And there is this sort of possibility that Baldwin alludes to at the end of the essay, that maybe a new kind of democracy can be formed by transcending some of these barriers and distinctions. And I think Baldwin was also pretty despondent about that project at the end of his life in the 1970s. But he's, I think, a little bit less willing to claim the great intellectual tradition of the West compared to Du Bois. But I think he's making certain claims about the opportunities of American culture that Du Bois might not have agreed to, and sort of look to America as a possible synthesis. Perhaps in all of these terrible conflicts, sort of West, non-West, the U.S. can be something of an honest broker. That at least would be the ideal scenario for Baldwin.
This is the last question from a viewer who writes, what role have schools and universities played in both the expansion and the abandonment of the West?
Well, schools and universities are the lifeblood of this story. The West is for the most part, not a burning concern for Americans. The United States is not a country like Turkey and Russia, where you have a brooding debate about whether a part of the West or not a part of the West. This is just not something that moves the majority of Americans. It tends to be the concern in the West of educated Americans. There's sort of a reason for that. And it has been either the gift or the curse of American universities. This is what American universities wanted to instill for a very long time. I'll review just a little bit of that history and then conclude about why it is that universities moved away from this commitment. So it was difficult to study American history and American literature in American universities until the late 19th century, early 20th century. The first PhD program in U.S., sort of history, American studies is 1937, which is U.S. history you could do earlier, but the first PhD program in American studies is 1937, which is astonishing. What is that? 150 years after the Republic is founded. So education up until that point was really European as such. It was Greek and Latin. It was classical education, Renaissance, maybe early modern, and then sort of things fell away. In the 1890s, Harvard got rid of the Greek and Latin requirement. That was considered to be a huge step in a new direction in American higher education. And then when Columbia did the same about a decade and a half later, their alumni were very angry. How can you educate people if they're not fluent in Greek and Latin, able to read these languages at least? And so the answer that Columbia came up with was the Western Civ program. This is what would give students what they needed, but not force them to spend many of their teenage years studying Greek and Latin. And so the Western Civ curriculum was born, something that people studied in English without too much scholarship, the sort of great books of the West. This was the curriculum that William McNeill studied as a student and sort of set him off on his career as a historian. It spread from Columbia to UChicago, to Stanford, sort of across American academia, St. John's College in Annapolis and elsewhere. And that was the vogue really until the 1960s and 70s. The reason it was felt to be inadequate has a lot to do with the multiculturalism of internal American life. So the sense that a West curriculum is just inadequate to a culture that is composed of many groups that don't have origins in Europe and the United States. And so you need to adequately understand these groups. You need to alter the curricula, the educational framework for studying their literature, their history, philosophy, religion, etc. But then there's also the politics of academia. So after Vietnam, the West just looks conservative. And of course, the culture wars are fought out in the universities in the 1980s while Ronald Reagan is president. And so there's a sort of anti-conservative agenda that's not universal in academia, but it is pretty strong. So now, if you would, I think, ask most American undergraduate students, graduate students, do you want to do something about the West? Do you want to study the West? It would just seem archaic to them. And if it wouldn't seem archaic to many students, depending on their politics, it would look politically suspicious. So that transition, it sounds maybe almost bland when I describe it in those terms, is probably one of the most consequential changes in American culture because it determines so much. And to make the point, to sort of end where I began, if you don't have universities teaching the West in the United States, it's not going to happen. American culture is thriving, it's vibrant, it's popular culture alone is endless in this country. You can live on all of that and be perfectly happy. You don't need the West necessarily. So if universities are not going to do it, it will sort of fade away and get lost. And that's, I think, simply why it's high stakes in terms of how universities approach these issues and the decisions they make. And that, too, is one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book.
Very well said. Thank you, Professor Michael Kimmage, for sharing your passion for history and talking us through this fascinating new book, The Abandonment of the West, The History of an Idea in American Foreign Policy, published by Basic Books. We're eager to have you back to speak to our audience. I want to also thank our viewers whom I invite to Zoom in or join us on Facebook at the same time on Thursday, May 14th, when my guest will be a recent graduate of our Cook Leadership Academy, Brent Reed. Brent, who recently earned his Master of Public Health Administration at GVSU, is deeply passionate about leading positive change within the American healthcare system, and he'll discuss his experience of leading in a crisis and helping providers transition to virtual care during the pandemic. Till Thursday at 1 p.m., stay tuned and stay well.